This is the Wheel of Time Spoilers podcast. Your hosts are Seth Jacobson and Patrick Heiler.
This is us again, doing that podcast thing again. We're sorry in advance.
It just keeps going around. We really do apologize. It's not getting any better.
I think it is, actually. It sounds good.
Well, we've only got one data point. How can it get better?
Okay.
Nothing to compare to.
See. So after our last recording session, we kind of decided that rather than go straight into the books, because for a lot of different reasons, but one of which is we don't really know what we're doing yet. And I thought it would be a good idea to at least do like one more kind of fluff episode that's not just breaking right into the eye of the world.
Absolutely.
I mean, this isn't fluff, but there's a there's a ton of time in between the prologue, which was what we talked about last time, and the time that Rand is born. Roughly 3,000 years.
I'm nodding.
Calendar changes 3 times. The first one is maybe not a real calendar. They just call it after breaking, or AB. So you get like 0 to 100 AB when you're looking at timelines.
Basically, when you talk about events, you're like, yeah, how long has it been since the world ended?
Right.
And that's it's sort of a pretty big marking point. So, yeah, I imagine that was the calendar for a while of just being like, hey,
yeah,
how long have you survived since the world was destroyed?
But so it counts like up to 1,000, basically 3 times, up to Ishmael showing up, and then people get so confused in the chaos that they continuously forget what year it is.
I think it's wonderful that we can tell Ishmael's appearances by the fact that the calendar resets.
Yeah, people stop knowing what
he
day
destroys
it is.
Civilization enough that, oh yeah, we need a new calendar because that was the end of that civilization.
He does a pretty good job each time he shows up, which, like we said last time, is every 1,000 years.
Give or take, based on the calendar, I was looking over some of those numbers. It looks like he shows up around 1,200 in one of the calendars. Is that just because of the weird way the math works between the calendars?
I think you're right.
Not really sure what's going on with the timeline, or if it's specifically 1,000, but it seems to be around that, give or take. It's these timelines are constructed out of side comments and stories that are told throughout the entire history. So there's a little bit of certainly gaps and missing bits. Some of it, I wonder does any of it come from the companion?
I think most of it comes from the companion. I saw that reference a lot of times. This episode takes place between the prologue and the first page of the first chapter, which is roughly 3,000 years of human history.
And the last thing we heard was basically Ishmael saying, your 100 companions are tearing this world apart, even as we speak.
Right.
So what are the immediate after effects that happen just in the years following the sealing of the bore?
The details from this particular time weren't the best, but there are some really interesting points. I started with the 100 companions ripping the world apart, which apparently lasts quite a while. Some of these insane male Aes Sedai, the dates I found were that the breaking lasts somewhere between 200 and 350 years. So there's a period of time where basically mankind is thrown into the Dark Ages, and there's presumably a few, at first thousands likely, of male channelers that would have been in the world.
Sure. And if you think about it, even though they're insane, channelers at the time live hundreds of years.
Right.
Up to 600 for some of the most powerful. Louis Theron himself was several hundred years old at the time of his death. If you have an insane channeler, his effect can last hundreds of years. And you compound that with the fact that they were hiding out in the steadings.
Oh, right. I forgot that point. Some of the 100 companions tried to isolate themselves in steadings for a long period of time.
I don't think it was the 100 companions. It was just other male channelers.
Just other male Aes Sedai.
Yeah, because the 100 companions were insane pretty much right away. But the other ones were trying not to channel by hiding out in the steading, where they couldn't access the one power.
But eventually, presumably, they would leave and
eventually go mad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's definitely conflicting theories on that as to whether that helped or hindered.
Or drew it out.
I
remember reading that somewhere.
Yeah. Moraine's talking to Loyal about the breaking, and she reassures him that she is one of the few who believes that, or not one of the few, but one of the ones who believes that the breaking would have been much worse if the men had all gone insane at the same time, and they would have basically destroyed the world to the point where nothing could live on it.
Yeah.
And so she thinks that even though it was prolonged, you're stretching that effect out over a longer period of time and preventing just the absolute destruction of everything.
Yeah. And there was a period of time, I don't know if I took note of this, but now that we're talking about this, there was a period of time where the Ogier were lost, and they didn't know, it took them time to find the steading again.
That's a good point.
That was definitely a thing.
Yeah, that was definitely a thing.
'Cause they didn't used to be bound to it, and something happened there.
Well, now, but if you think about it, before the breaking fully took form, they knew where the steadings were. They lived in the steadings.
Right.
So it wasn't, think about it this way. They let a bunch of men stay in their steadings. The men leave, eventually go insane, come back, destroy them, misplace them, break the world. The Ogier can no longer find the steadings and have to wander around finding them again. Because I think there was a period of time where they do find the steadings again. I think you had that note.
Yeah, I have it here. Or one of the very second note that I thought was interesting is that basically the breaking begins and the Aiel and Ogier begin their exile, it's described as. And there's a couple different reasons for that. Shit, now I want to read more about the Ogier. But
the Ogier is such a fascinating story that we just don't get any details on. Because the steadings are not part of this universe.
that would make sense.
Right? Because you have no access to the one power.
Why would it work that way?
Right.
Are the Ogier from one of the mirror worlds, or not? Or probably shouldn't call it that. One of the
They're portal worlds?
portal worlds.
Possibly.
I think mirror worlds is another series.
Well, and don't forget about the Book of Translation.
Yeah, to go home.
To go home. Where's home? Right. We don't know. And so that's one of the many unanswered questions is where do the Ogier actually come from? What world? What is it like? Why are they here? We never really get anything other than, they know they have to leave because they have to come back when the wheel turns again. So at some point in one of the ages, the Ogier leave. And then at some point they come back. And we don't know why.
Yeah. I'll get more into this part later, but that makes me wonder if Hawkwing sent the armies across the Aerith Ocean, if he sent Ogier with them, or if they were already there.
Oh, I have no idea.
No, I don't think I don't remember any mentions of that.
Right.
But there were people there.
Certainly.
We can get more into that later, because that's an actual part that will happen in like an hour. when we work our way somewhere past the third point.
I love the fact that we have a whole episode.
We can cut
on,
a bunch of this.
No, this is all going in. This is great. This is gold. I love the fact that we're doing a whole episode on the blank page between two chapters.
Yeah. Well, yeah. This is the Spoilers podcast, and we know all the spoilers. Well, most of them.
Yeah, so it's definitely a front-heavy situation at this point, where we have a lot of information to get out of the way. And, I think that's a bit of the beauty of the series, is someone starts reading these books, they start reading Eye of the World, and they're looking at it and going, oh, it's a farmer. It's, this is a stereotype. Oh. And someone who has finished the series, like you and I, are looking at it and going, okay, I turn the page and there's 3,000 years of history that I know about at this point. And it's very hard for someone new to the series to really sort of understand just how much history there is in every single page, which is
that's so good.
Partially why I want to do this podcast, because I think the appreciation for the blank page between, the prologue and the first episode.
That Emond's Field was named that because it was named after the Battle of Aemon's Field for the last stand of Manetheren, where
the king Aemon fell.
Fell, and his wife was driven insane by the breaking of the water bond, or inconsolably upset, or I don't know what you call it. I think insane might be the right word. when the water bond breaks. Even Aes Sedai seem to, or sometimes lose it.
Grief can definitely drive you insane. And I think the breaking of the water bond is grief turned up to 11.
Yeah, so what an epic place to be born, really. Even though when you first visit in the very first chapter of the first book, it looks like...
back asswards of nowhere.
Yeah. Virginia in 1540. It's real boring. Essentially just wool and tobacco.
So basically my hometown in 1540 is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Is he a Virginian? He's a Southerner, right?
Yeah, he went to one of the military colleges. Can't remember which one.
That's right. I think it was a prestigious one.
Yeah. One of the big ones that I can't remember right now. Sorry, everyone who went there. I'm sure you're very angry right now.
Yeah. It's a million fans yelling it at us.
Right. There's definitely mythology about like a bunch of the streets in this neighborhood became like there's Ogier Street in his neighborhood, and that's where he got the name for Ogier. Yeah, totally.
That's great.
And so you can like walk around the streets and see like character names and stuff, or vaguely related to them anyway.
Why not?
Yeah.
Probably thought no one would ever notice.
Who knows? I mean, or you don't care. Yeah, I mean, you look when you're coming up with 3 million names, you need to draw them from somewhere.
Yeah.
There's enough unique words in this book that, well, he draws from a lot of languages. And the fact that he draws from the street signs when he's walking around is not a huge surprise.
I've noticed a couple of different methods that he clearly used to name things and places and people.
I love that he sticks with people names on a theme. So, the folks from Camelin tend to be named very Arthurian names.
Yeah.
But then you come up with a totally different name for the naming scheme for the Borderlands, and then a different name for naming scheme for the Kyrian. And so very much like in our current world, like you can pretty much identify where someone is based on their name.
Yeah.
Moraine Damondred, well, okay, she's clearly related to the royal family, but her name is very Kyrian. Lan Almon Dragarin, very Borderland name. And the fact that that is a stereotype is great. That like they seem like pretty normal names. Lan, Ran, Matt, Tame, single syllable names. But when you get the full name, it really fits into the whole structure of that culture.
Yeah. Listening to you say that made me think I saw someone speculate that Bonwyn, who's like the first Aes Sedai, or the first Amerlin Sea to be stilled. Somebody was speculating that she was born in the Far Matting area, and you see that later with Catswain. I think Catswain's surname has the same suffix.
Oh, sure.
The IN, and you see it with other characters from
right. He's really a great linguist as well, I think. We've had a breaking. We've had Ogier and Aiel sent wandering.
So during this crazy first approximately 350 years, nobody actually knows. Nobody actually knows how long this went on for.
Well, there's not a lot of surviving records.
Yeah, because the human and Ogier races were brought nearly to extinction. And the end of the breaking is measured as technically ending when the last male Aes Sedai is gentled. Got to kind of wonder about that last male Aes Sedai. Like, well, wasn't it pretty much over when there was only like 3 left or so? I guess one could do a lot of damage, but still.
Well, and there's a difference between officially and technically,
Yeah.
It may have officially been done when the last one was destroyed, but we see how much damage even a single false dragon can do in modern society.
True.
Just one male channeler wandering the countryside creating chaos is not insignificant. If you've got a world that's still cooling from the damage of a bunch of other ones, finding safe haven anywhere, growing some crops, just one guy can come along and do a lot of damage because there's no buffer.
So this was likely a brutal time, ruled totally by conflict and madmen, extremely powerful madmen. Because at the end here, right before the end of what's considered the time of the breaking, Kalendor is stored inside the stone, which is created at the very end, essentially, of that approximately 350-year period.
You need security somewhere. It seems like it would make sense to create a big fortress to protect yourself.
Yeah. Did I say the Stone of Tyr? I meant the Stone of Tyr.
I think you said the Stone of Tyr.
Okay.
Which, by the way, can we just comment on the fact that the sword in the stone is an Arthurian reference.
Literally inside the stone.
Literally,
Jesus.
yeah.
I don't know why I never thought of that either.
You never thought about the sword
inside the stone?
Yeah, and when Rand goes and gets it, and in the third book, he pulls the sword from the stone and becomes the king.
Oh yeah, it's literally he sinks it back into the floor tiles. Where is it?
It's just floating.
It's floating.
Yeah. But here it's a metaphorical, the stone is the fortress, and he pulls the sword from the stone, being the fortress. And then he sticks it back into the stone, being the actual stone floor. And then you have the whole Narishma thing that he who pulls the sword will follow after, and that is such a weird prophecy that never amounts to anything.
Will follow after?
Yeah, it's part of the Corinthian cycle. It's a line that we get at some point, and it says, basically, I honestly don't have it in front of me, but it's a really simple quote that for a long time, it's pretty early on in the books, and for a long time, people were waiting to see, like, who's going to follow after? What does that mean? Who's going to pull the sword out of the stone and follow after? Like, is that a big deal? No, it's not a big deal. I mean, some guy went and got the sword and followed Rand and gave it to him. Like, it was a ridiculously minor prophecy. And Robert Jordan definitely comments that, he wrote prophecies about major and minor events. He thought that was really important to include really stupid minor events in the prophecies.
Oh, I like that. I didn't know that.
And that's one of those, like, this is one of those minor events that, like, yeah, the guy got it and gave it to Rand. He played a messenger boy, and that was prophesized.
Yeah. If stuff from the future just pops into your head, you're probably going to write it all down.
Right. Totally. So I really like that take on it. And, for a while it bothered me because I was like, who's going to follow after? Like, like that was something important, and it's not. So.
Yeah.
I mean, other than the fact that Rand can now trust Narishma, this man had the most powerful sangreal available to him, and he just handed it over to Rand. So it's always good to have someone you can trust. So he knew that the person who followed after would be someone he could trust. And he doesn't have many of those.
Sense made. Did Min help him with that?
Probably. Because
she was all his research.
Oh, dude, she is all up in that prophecy. She is so smart. Again, if you trust her and listen to her, she says, oh, I'm dumb, I don't get it. And then she, decodes Herod Fell's notes, who's like this great scholar. And she does it without any real formal training.
Yeah.
And figures out things that no one else could figure out, and is basically...
Of the three, I'd pick Min. She's a babe.
Absolutely. Min,
best personality for sure.
Definitely.
Like, by far.
She's playful, she's fun.
How long are you going to hang out with Avienda for? Or Elaine, for that matter.
Yeah, but, if I was going camping or hunting, I don't want to have Avienda right by my side.
Or into combat.
Oh, yeah, totally. If into combat, yeah.
Either of the other two.
Yeah. And that ice cave was just a good time.
Oh yeah, the ice cave. What a way to lose your virginity.
Yeah. Unlike Matt, who we don't really get to know when he loses virginity because he's just throwing it around left and right.
Yeah, we have to assume that happens pretty quickly.
Yeah. With some tavern maid or another.
Yeah.
Or possibly in Emmons Field.
It's possible.
I don't reference it really, but...
No, nobody mentions it.
And it certainly doesn't happen while he still has the dagger. I'm curious. It's got to be pretty
He's
quickly.
Not even, like, around a lot of women at that point.
Yeah.
But...
maybe in Tarvalin after he, like, wins all that money the night that he can't lose.
Yeah, well, he, like, never loses.
There is... Oh, okay, we need to get to chapter 1 sooner rather than later because I've been reading that and I've got things to say. So let's keep going.
Right, so the first couple of things to happen after this wild 350-year period that they call the Breaking is groups of survivors start to settle. I couldn't find very much timeline for this either to keep it super concise, but one of the very first things to happen is a group of survivors that fled the coast on ships and had survived fishing at sea, presumably, and landing on small islands to collect resources and go back into the ocean, arrives back in the Westlands, or in the islands south of the Westlands, and they make their home there. They're later known as the Sea Folk.
Yeah, the sea folk. That's why they're born on the ships, because they don't trust the land not to shift.
Right.
Because they're used to, the legends were formed during the breaking when they couldn't trust the land, and so they live their entire lives on their ships if they can.
We see the sea folk as a homogenous people later in the book, like they're all a homogenous ethnic group.
Well, we see only a small minority.
They appear to be like, Indian or something, but we can assume that this was groups of random survivors at first who just ended up being a roughly brown, coppery skinned people 3,000 years later.
So I think of them as a much darker folk. I think of them as black skinned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I remember descriptions of dark skin.
Right. I guess I think of them as going into the various skin color. Like the Shan Shan is a mix of all sorts of different skin colors. They have light, dark.
But they don't seem to be a homogenous ethnic group.
No, not at all.
There's
the continent's way too big.
Right. I remember at some point Rand describes seeing a soldier with a skin as black as coal, I think he says. And he's just like...
And Tuon is obviously very black. And,
how do I always forget?
Yeah. But there's tons of not, that they're not the only ethnicity there, and despite the fact that they have an incredibly homogeneous culture, they have a very diverse ethnicity.
Yeah.
But the sea folk I've always thought of as being, they talk about them having like curly, tight hair and being black as coal, and I think of them as very much a
much darker,
much darker. But I think that the sort of brown culture comes from we think of like a Persian sailors is sort of the culture the sea folk have.
Yeah, that seems to be.
And so I would think of them as
with
more
like the nose piercings, and it made me think more of like Southeast Asia.
Right, and that seems to be their culture, but I think physically they appear closer to black Africans.
Yeah.
Which Jordan loves to do. He mixes people up, makes the Shan Shan sound like Texans.
Yeah.
Which I don't think they sound like Texans. They just have a slower way of speaking.
I mean, it would make sense that they'd have even like a thicker dialect. I mean, 1,000 years is a long time to remain isolated.
3,000 years and everyone still speaks the same language? That seems highly unlikely.
They just have like it sounds more like a regional dialect. Like they understand each other perfectly.
Yeah, totally.
Just not culturally. It would be really lame if you couldn't have conversations without translators. So after the sea folk arrive, the Aiel, who had apparently stayed together up until this point, were still the servant type Aiel.
Well, they were still Aes Sedai at this point, so they were still serving the Aes Sedai.
Makes sense. The Aiel splinter into 3 distinct groups that we get to see later. One, of course, being the Tuatha'an, one being the Gen Aiel, and the other being everybody else. I want to say the Spear of the Dragon.
Think of them as the Aiel of the Wastes.
Okay.
Which, of course, they end up further splintering into the Shido and the non-Shido. The Aiel, as they split, you have the Tinkers who stay...
keep the way of the leaf.
Keep the way of the leaf. They stay peaceful. And they tend to pick up local folk, so they tend to genetically be pretty much not related to the Aiel. Because they do have so much of just wherever they travel, they adopt people, and they have children that come into their philosophy and come into their troops.
Yeah.
Then you have the Aiel who travel with the Gen Aiel into the Wastes, but the Gen Aiel just don't last very long.
Right. You don't hear very much about these people after the construction of Rudaean, which happens with the help of several described as ancient Aes Sedai, the construction of Rudaean, shortly after the Aiel crossed the spine of the world.
I say Ruhidion, I think.
Ruhidion, is that
Ruhidion.
right?
I had an extra syllable, I'm not...
I think Ruidian... I think that's the way they say it in the book on tape.
That's the way I say it.
I've always said Rudaean in my head.
Totally fine.
But it's probably Ruidian.
Use whatever words pronunciation you want in your own head. I am down with that. I am merely using the audiobook for convenience at this point.
Also, shortly after the breaking, the people who live in Shanshan, so these aren't the post-Arthur Hawkwing invasion Shanshan, are embroiled in war with the Shadow Spawn, and begin using the Portal Stone animals. So pretty early on, this is happening.
The Grolm?
Right.
The three-eyed toad-looking things?
And the flying ones.
The Rockin'.
Right.
And the Toe Rockin'. I'd just like to point out we are through page 1 of your notes and 35 minutes into recording. And you have...
Some of this later might just be me reading, but we've been talking a lot about stuff so far.
We have been.
I don't know.
I'm going to let you maybe go through a few of these points.
Okay.
Yeah, so it looks like you got some dates coming up, and I'm going to let you run through them just as the quick years after the breaking and what happens for the next 1,000 years.
I have at 98 after breaking, Elisan Taishar is elected the first post-breaking Amerlin seat.
Right, so we have a group of female Aes Sedai that survive.
Right.
And elect in Amerlin.
After uniting a few competing factions. In 202, after breaking, the construction of Tarvalin is completed. In 209, the Compact of 10 Nations, this part's pretty important, for mutual defense and trade is created. This compact, like I said, of the 10 nations are some of the older nations that you'd be familiar with. If you've already read the series, you probably should have if you're listening to this.
I think we can pretty much assume
I don't know if
that
it
you
would
have.
even make any sense what we're saying.
If you're listening to this and you're not related to me and you haven't read the series, then you're probably related to Patrick.
Hi, Mom. It's the only person that's ever going to listen to this.
But seriously, if you haven't, if you're not one of those people, put the podcast down and go read this thing. And I'll see you in a year.
The Compact of 10 Nations is created. That compact is held for 800 years before any of these nations break that trust.
So it's a pretty impressive run.
And after that came a time of peace. During this time, many of the great cities were constructed by Ogier stonemasons who had just learned how to be stonemasons. We also see the translation of the first few Koreathon cycle.
So these, where do they come from? Where are they translated? You know, they say they're translated, but translated from what into what? Is it from the Old Tongue? Is it...
You know, I saw these points and I wondered the same thing. It must be from the Old Tongue to not Old Tongue.
Common. They call it common?
Is that I don't know what they call it.
That's a good point. What the hell language do we speak?
I don't have any points in here that talk about the change from Old Tongue to Common. I'm just using that, but...
Yeah, there's a good point. When does that change occur? Because in the Age of Legends, they are speaking the Old Tongue, right?
Presumably.
Yeah.
I mean...
Unless they're a society with two languages, which is entirely possible.
Well, the series seems to have it that even during the Trolloc Wars, they were speaking the Old Tongue.
Yeah. Listeners, if you know when...
Yeah, that's a good question.
Let's spoil that for me. Tell me when they figured out, or when they transitioned from the Old Tongue to the New Tongue, Common, whatever we want to call it.
So sometime shortly after many of the first great cities are created, like Tarvalin, Rowland Darksbane becomes known as the first ever false dragon, sometime around 400 years after the breaking.
Manipulated by the Aes Sedai? Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah, I just have that he's defeated and gentled by the White Tower. The White Tower was also fresh at this time, and it seems like the wars between, or conflicts between the different factions were pretty brutal. So I wouldn't be too surprised if they were kind of trying to pull a move to raise a false dragon and then strike him down to be like, look, we're the fucking Aes Sedai for real.
That wouldn't surprise me. I mean, certainly I think the Ajahs weren't necessarily settled at this point either.
Yeah, I think they weren't permanent yet.
No, at this point they were still just basically committees, and they'd form and break up and form and break up. and wouldn't necessarily persist through the years.
We got this roughly 700-year period of peace. That's kind of excluding the time that Rowland Darksbane could have affected. I don't have a ton of history between that time. And these same 10 nations exist all the way until the Trolloc Wars, which begin sometime around 1,000 years after breaking. These 10 nations exist for at least that long, 800 years.
Yeah, and that's a good amount of time, and they create a lot of history and statues and a lot of artifacts that we see later in the series.
It's also probably important to make the point that the people at this time, even though the breaking has really just ended, were probably unaware of a time where there would have been such a thing as like dozens and dozens of warring nations. They were obviously accustomed to warfare at this point. To have a relatively singular human government, I mean, there's 10 different, or I suppose you could say 11 if you include the White Tower as a governing force in the Westlands, but that was all, and they cooperated relatively well, with only a few sort of trade conflicts and things, until
this thing called the Blight started to fill up.
1,000 years after the breaking, an enormous army of Trollocs, led by dreadlords, invades the Westlands from the Blight. The Trolloc Wars began with heavy raids into then borderland nations, of which I think there were 5 of. Fairly quickly afterward, the sacking of a city called Barcine in the nation of Jeremide. The White Tower and the 10 nations rallied to fight the Shadow Spawn, but not quickly enough to save Aramel, which was a more northern nation. Although they acted quickly enough to save Jeremide, not Aramel, which left Aradal, which we know later as Shadar Logoth, to be the front line of the war on Trollocs.
It's interesting. I would think it would be a little too far south to be the front line.
Well, that's because one of these borderland nations fell pretty quickly.
Okay.
So it looks like while...
just during the war, became the new frontier.
Right.
Okay. And then after the war, they were pushed back.
The whole nation was totally overrun.
But yeah, I mean, I think these Trolloc Wars were pretty intense for a while. It was a lot of Trollocs flooding down, through Tarwin's Gap, down into those northern nations, and creating just total chaos in the Southern Lands for...
And they last a serious amount of time.
Yeah, how long do they last? A couple hundred years?
Yeah, I think 200 or so. 300 years. Yeah. From 1,000 years after the breaking to 1,300.
And it seems to be that in the beginning, the light side seems to be doing pretty well until our favorite Ishmael is reborn. Certainly in the beginning, it appears that the light is pushing the dark back.
Right.
They're winning, and then there's a sudden resurgence.
Looks like although they're taken by surprise, they develop some new tactics pretty quickly, which start to work well. We see a big offensive by the Shadow against Aradal after the development of these new tactics by the humans, presumably in response, because the Shadow, although they had the element of surprise right off the bat and managed to take a couple of large cities, it looks like humanity pushed back really quickly.
Well, when you have a bunch of Trollocs flooding into your land, you're going to push back. That's pretty much.
You don't really have a choice.
No, it's either fight or starve is your only choice.
Fight or be eaten.
Be eaten. Well, yeah. No one wants to end up in a cook pot. Let's be honest. Like, there's something horrifying about dying, but there's something more horrifying about being eaten.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just. Ugh. But that's where the Trollocs, they don't need supply lines. They just eat their enemies and they eat their dead. It's a huge advantage if you don't need supply lines.
Yeah.
And it makes for a tough fight. A Trolloc is kind of a perfect fighting machine. It's big, it's fast, it's mean, it wants to kill. It'll eat anything you throw at it.
And it's stupid enough to do all those things. It looks like by the time the Shadow's renewed offensive against Eridol begins, the then king, who was named Balwin Mael, was by then already under the influence of Mordeth, who seemingly was a random person who sort of wandered into the court and somehow gained influence over the king.
We don't know anything about his origins.
We know very little about Mordeth. I tried, and we know that he is under the influence now, or possibly a little later, or maybe already, I'm not sure, of a entity called Mashadar.
I think that's later.
I know almost nothing about either, and I looked into it. Is a mysterious force that nobody seems to know if it's intelligent or not, or or what it is, if it isn't magic.
So I have theories.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Go for it.
So Mashadar is essentially the evil in men's hearts.
But how does it manage to manifest itself in like a physical?
That's basically what happens to Eridol, is this corruption, this evil that he is spreading is just so intense and so awful. In the same way that the Dark One is, manifests, I believe that this evil in men's hearts manifests as a misty being, and it inherits and sinks into the very stones of the city.
That's right. I think, isn't that similar to the theory that Moraine puts forward on what happened to Shadar Logoth? Doesn't she say something similar?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think she's essentially correct.
But we definitely know that Mordeth or Mashadar are not the Shadow.
They are by far enemies, right? They were on the side of good, right? They were fighting the Shadow.
Yeah.
A warning tale of saying, the ends don't justify the means, right? Fighting the Shadow does not justify becoming evil in its own right. And that's, I think, where this evil comes from. And that's it. All of Eridol is this basically internal evil as opposed to an external evil. This jealousy and envy and all of the emotions that we see Matt displaying in when he is in possession of the dagger.
Ooh, that's a good demonstration of the kind of general attributes of Mashadar.
Absolutely. I don't think Mordeth is that evil. I think that evil arises from the fact that everyone basically buys into his philosophy in the city. And you have an entire city of people who feel evil in their hearts, and it's so powerful that it manifests physically in the pattern and creates Mashadar. And I think they're separate entities in the beginning, but they merge into one in Fane's body.
Yeah, Mordeth is an interesting character.
Oh yeah, and we definitely have to get into him. Oh man, I've been reading ahead and I've gotten to chapter 3.
Do a whole episode on Pat and Fane.
Absolutely. I mean, chapter 3 is called the Peddler.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good time to
Already
really
there.
get into him. Yeah. So we'll get there definitely and talk about how he becomes what he becomes, because it's one of, I think, the most interesting parts of the book that gets not nearly enough time.
Geez, Pat and Fane is a really interesting character, but also this kind of idea that there's a sort of a chaotic element thrown in later.
Sure.
That's not for the light or the shadow. So I should probably throw out there that Eridol's new battle cry becomes "The victory of light is all," and you can see the really basic philosophical flaws in there, like you were saying.
They're basically yelling out the ends justify the means.
Right.
That's essentially like the light is all, the light being the ends.
And Mordeth's whole philosophy is that the only way to defeat the shadow, and by now they've been struggling for some time, is to be more brutal and cold than the shadow, even more unrelenting. And so somehow Mashadar is created, and presumably begins to infect not only Mordeth, but at least Mordeth has this great influence over the king with this evil entity manipulating them both. In light of these events, and some of the nations are becoming aware of the increasing panic and insanity that's going on inside Eridol, Kar Althorin attempted to win the people of Eridol back to the forces of the light.
Wait, was his name really Althorin?
Right, Althorin. Yeah, really. Kar, Caar, Althorin.
That's crazy.
There's Alcars, I'm sure, in the Two Rivers somewhere.
Right, but he's Eridol. He's not in any way related to the Manetheren and the Two Rivers, right?
Oh no, the Prince of Manetheren.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't think I said that. His name's, well, we already got that part.
Did we really? Did we? Are you sure?
Travels to Eridol to win its people back to the light. But instead, he was quickly imprisoned, tortured, and eventually, legend has it, lost a hand either during the torture sessions or while he was harried during his escape. Now, Manetheren actually becomes the front line of the Trolloc Wars because Aramel, I think, was the name of the nation, falls, and then Shadar Logoth is the front line, then Shadar Logoth falls, and Manetheren's the front line.
Okay.
And the line keeps coming down, so we can... if that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. Yeah. Because you've got the Trollocs sweeping down from the north, conquering nation after nation, and they started with Arafel and then took out Eridol.
Yeah.
Eridol corrupted itself basically, and then you're left with the next most southern nation, which is Manetheren. So you have this long line of Trollocs to the east and west. There are nations still holding, right? Yeah, but really they're basically cutting the continent in half. Once they've carved it into two separate parts.
That seems like what they're trying to do.
We don't have good histories from back then. Apparently, the Trolloc Wars really destroyed a lot of good history.
There's a huge fire about 650 years after the Trolloc Wars called the Great Fire of Tarvalon, and it destroys like a lot of the library at the time. But whatever records were around, we don't know.
Yeah.
and almost none of the nations that were around during the Trolloc Wars survive after.
Right.
Or very long, anyway.
Right.
I think only 5 are left at the end of the war out of 10.
Do any of those 5 survive to modern times?
No. Not to modern times.
Right. So not even like Caemlyn's not around back then. There's no...
No, there's no Caemlyn.
There's no Tyr. There's no Cairhien.
Nope. All those nations are formed after the War of the 100 Years.
Okay.
After the Trolloc Wars, the nations that do exist fall apart. Yeah. The 5 remaining nations, weakened from 300 years of war, break into 29 separate monarchies after a generation of factional infighting.
Oh, wow. Okay, so there's basically nothing left. You basically have a completely collapsed society after the Trolloc Wars.
Right.
Oh, Ishmael strikes again.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next calendar?
They're called the Free Years.
The Free Years. Now we're measuring in FE.
Or FY.
FY, sorry. Yes. So what are the 3 eras again? Go over it again. Remind me.
After breaking.
AB.
And then... the Free Years.
FY.
And then New Era.
And then NE.
Which ends at the end of Hawkwing's rule when he eventually dies mysteriously.
So what's the modern day calendar?
New Era.
New Era. So we're still in New Era. Got it.
Yeah. Clan Chief Janduin convinces just 4 clans of the Aiel to execute King Laman in 976. Is when the clans make the agreement, but the battle goes on, or the war goes on for at least 2 years.
It may take them a while to get over the spine of the world.
Yeah, they have to run like 2,000 miles. It takes a while.
Not for the Aiel. They do that before breakfast. Are you kidding me? Yeah. Well, you know what it's like to walk a couple thousand miles.
I do. It takes a long time.
Yeah.
Persistence.
Between the AT and the PCT, how many miles have you walked?
Oh, between those two, it was a little over 5,000.
5,000, yeah. So, just across the country. That's, oh God, man, I wonder how many miles Rand and folk walk in these books. I mean, it's mostly in the first couple, because once they get traveling, they definitely don't rack the miles up.
Oh, tons.
basically, Rand land is the size of the U.S. It's about 3,000 miles across, give or take. So to walk from one side to the other is like walking from California to New York.
Yeah. If you were real fast about it, I feel like I know some people who could do it in 2 or 3 months. The pros, like the people who were the record holders, there was a lady, I think she might still be the record holder, that completed the Appalachian Trail in like 50 days or something like that. But you have to run like 40 miles a day, basically.
Yeah, I can do that. No, there's no way I could do that.
I got into all my running and distance, got into endurance sports after reading The Wheel of Time, and just sort of got super into the Aiel. I mean, I got to have an Aiel-inspired tattoo for all the people who are not looking at me.
No, I mean, that's how I originally knew that you liked the series. I think the first day we met, I looked at you and said...
I think you pointed it out.
Hey, I see you like The Wheel of Time. We're going to be best friends.
So, I think we still need to say that since we just finished talking about the fall of Eridol and we worked our way through the first 1,300 years after the breaking, we're going to take a short break.
I think we're going to take a long break, yeah. I think
actually we're getting together next week.
Right, yeah, we want to finish this one up and put this out, and then we're going to do one more podcast before the beginning of chapter 1, just to cover the rest of the 1,000 years, 2,000 years that we have left.
Yeah, about 1,000.
About 1,000.
1,500 something.
Yeah, somewhere between this. So we've got a good amount of time left, and we'll do that in the second podcast.
Yeah, we still got to put a cap on the end of the Trolloc Wars too, but we'll do it. We can get that done.
Yeah,
today.
we'll get that done. All right. See you next week.
See you next week.
Bye.
But I used just a couple different fan sites. Mainly, I think it's just called the Wheel of Time Wiki. Super handy.
Super wonderful.
Yeah.
I can't say enough about how much I love the fan websites out there. They've really provided a lot of knowledge to me over the years and for this. So thank you.
I did try hard not to plagiarize, but...
Fair use.
Any money off this,
Fair use. Not yet. Advertisers, my email contact is on the website, wtspoilers.com, if you'd like to advertise. Please send me an email. I think my mother would love to buy whatever product you're selling, because she's the only one
drinking
listening.
Hop Valley.
Hop Valley Brewing Company.
Delicious pale ale.
Wonderful.
Send us an email.
Brewed in Eugene, Oregon. We do love local Oregon companies. Wonderful.